The Young and the Restless Spoilers. The night had fallen over Genoa City with a chill that seemed to creep through every windowpane of Memorial Hospital. The corridors were silent, the faint hum of machines echoing in the stillness. Noah lay motionless under the harsh white light, his face pale and drawn, as if all the vitality that once fueled his laughter and artistic spirit had been drained away by the shadows that now stalked him. He had been through hell in recent months, the failed business venture, the emotional collapse after Sharon's relapse, and the constant fear of Matt, the man whose very name had become synonymous with danger. Noah and Sienna had been planning to leave, to disappear from the chaos that had swallowed their lives. They spoke in hushed voices about new beginnings, about faraway cities where no one would recognize them, where love might finally be allowed to exist without fear. But fate, or perhaps something darker, had already sealed their destiny. Nick and Sharon had thought Matt's threats were empty, the ravings of a desperate man clinging to old grudges. Nick believed that the hospital, guarded and sterile, was the safest place his son could be. Sharon prayed every night for peace, for one day when Noah's heart wouldn't be chained to fear. Neither of them could have imagined that the very place meant to protect him would become the stage for the most chilling act of vengeance Genoa City had seen in years. The evening had started quietly, nurses passing between rooms, doctors completing late rounds, unaware that the walls themselves were about to witness an unspeakable crime. In the hours before dawn, the air grew heavy. A shadow slipped through the maintenance corridor, tall, deliberate, and disturbingly calm. Security cameras flickered once, then went dark, as if recognizing the presence of something that didn't belong. The man was dressed entirely in black, his movements precise and unhurried. Beneath the surgical mask covering his face, his eyes gleamed with the cold precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. He carried a small syringe filled with a colorless liquid, a poison so lethal that even a few drops could still the heart within minutes. To any other patient, this would have been a simple injection. But for Noah Newman, it was a silent execution, a message meant to echo far beyond the sterile walls of his hospital room. The man paused at the door. He could hear the rhythmic sound of Noah's breathing, shallow but steady. For a brief second, he hesitated, not out of mercy, but calculation. Then he entered. The room was dim, the only light coming from the monitors that blinked steadily beside the bed. Noah stirred faintly, perhaps sensing something wrong, but before he could open his eyes, the man pressed the syringe to his arm and injected the poison. The act took only seconds, yet it carried the weight of a decade's worth of hatred. When it was done, the figure turned and slipped out as silently as he had come, leaving behind no trace except the faint scent of antiseptic and death. Hours later, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the hospital windows, Nick arrived. He had barely slept, his mind consumed with guilt for every fight he had ever had with his son, every word left unsaid. He brought coffee for Sharon, thinking this would be another long day of waiting and hoping. But when he stepped into Noah's room, the cup fell from his hands and shattered on the floor. Noah's body was convulsing, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth, his skin already turning gray. The monitors erupted in chaos's beeping, flashing, screaming for attention as Nick shouted for help. Within seconds, nurses and doctors flooded the room, pulling Nick back as they fought to revive his son. The sound of defibrillators filled the hallway, echoing off the sterile walls like thunder. Sharon arrived moments later, her face a mask of disbelief. She stood frozen at the doorway, unable to breathe, watching as the medical team surrounded her son's body. Time seemed to collapse around her, the years of laughter, heartbreak, forgiveness, and love all blending into one unbearable moment of silence. She wanted to reach out, to call his name, but her voice was gone, stolen by the horror of what she was seeing. Nick stood beside her, his hands trembling, his mind spinning with denial. This couldn't be happening. Not Noah. Not their child. The doctor finally stepped back, sweat beading on his forehead. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of finality, he said the words that shattered everything: someone poisoned him. The silence that followed was deafening. Sharon's knees buckled, and Nick caught her before she hit the floor. The word poisoned echoed in his head like a curse. The doctor continued, the toxin was fast-acting, injected directly into Noah's bloodstream sometime during the night. Whoever did it had known exactly what they were doing. Nick demanded to know how it could have happened, how anyone could have walked into the hospital, past security, into his son's room. The staff had no answers. The security cameras had gone offline for 37 minutes between 2 o'clock and 2:37 a.m., precisely when the attack must have occurred. When the footage was reviewed, the only image they recovered was of a dark silhouette disappearing down the east corridor, face obscured by a mask. Sharon could barely stand as she listened, her body trembling uncontrollably. She whispered Matt's name, her voice hoarse with terror. Nick's expression hardened. He had dismissed Matt before as a delusional threat, but now he knew, the man was not only real, he was close. The investigation began immediately. Detectives arrived within hours, sealing the floor and interviewing staff. The poison was identified as a rare neurotoxin, difficult to trace and nearly impossible to obtain legally. It was the same substance once rumored to be used in covert assassinations, odorless, tasteless, and fatal in under 5 minutes. The realization hit them all at once, this wasn't a random act of violence. This was a message, a personal vendetta executed with chilling precision. And if Matt truly was behind it, then Noah's death, or near death, was only the beginning. But the doctors refused to give up. Noah's heart had stopped twice, yet somehow, faint signs of brain activity still flickered on the monitors. Against all odds, he was alive, barely. The team worked frantically, flushing his system, administering antidotes, and keeping him on life support. Hours bled into each other as the hospital fought to pull him back from the edge. Sharon refused to leave his side, clutching his hand, whispering silent prayers, tears streaming down her face. Nick stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the skyline of Genoa City, rage building inside him. He had failed to protect his son once, he would not fail again. Outside the hospital, word began to spread. The Newmans were under attack once more, and this time it wasn't corporate espionage or scandal, it was something far darker. Victor, upon hearing the news, immediately dispatched private security to protect the family. He ordered his own investigation, unwilling to rely solely on the police. To Victor, this was more than a crime, it was an assault on the Newman legacy itself. But for Nick and Sharon, this wasn't about legacy. It was about love, loss, and vengeance. As night fell again, the hospital corridor outside Noah's room became a war zone of emotions. Sharon sat beside her son, her fingers brushing against the lifeless skin of his hand, while Nick pored over security reports, looking for any detail, any clue that might lead them to the monster who had done this. Sienna returned briefly, her eyes red and hollow. She blamed herself for everything, for not convincing Noah to leave sooner, for not staying with him through the night. She confessed that they had planned to run away together, that they knew Matt was coming, but fear had paralyzed them both. Now it was too late for regret. Somewhere in the city, a man watched the news in silence. His gloved hands rested on the same syringe he had used hours before. He turned it over once, twice, before tossing it into the fire. His face was still hidden behind the mask, but his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. To him, this wasn't murder. It was justice, twisted, personal, and absolute. Noah's suffering was payment for sins buried years ago, for betrayals no one else remembered. But in his mind, the ledger was still not balanced. Back in the hospital, Noah's condition remained critical. The machines kept him alive, but the doctors warned that even if he survived, he might never wake again. Sharon broke down completely, sobbing into Nick's chest, while Nick stood rigid, his face carved with fury. He swore silently that he would find whoever did this, even if it meant descending into the same darkness that had tried to claim his son. The security team was instructed to review every frame of footage, every visitor's record, every entry and exit from the building. Nothing would be overlooked. As the clock struck midnight, the lights flickered again. A nurse walking past the hallway swore she saw a shadow near the stairwell, but when she turned, it was gone. The fear had returned, an invisible presence haunting every corner of the hospital. And somewhere, deep within the mechanical rhythm of Noah's heart monitor, there was the faintest hint of defiance, a single, weak pulse refusing to fade. It was as if Noah himself was fighting, not just for life, but to expose the truth behind the mask. The Newmans stood at a crossroads of hope and despair. If Noah lived, he could become the key to unraveling the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him. If he died, his death would ignite a storm of vengeance that no one in Genoa City could escape. For now, the only certainty was the cold hum of machines and the knowledge that somewhere out there Matt, or whoever was behind the mask, was still watching, waiting for the next move. And as dawn broke once more, the city itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing that the real nightmare had only just begun. The hours that followed were a blur of disbelief and dread. The hospital, once a place of healing, now felt like a tomb suspended in time. Outside Noah's room, Nick paced the floor like a man possessed, his hands clenched, his face pale with exhaustion and fury. Sharon sat motionless by her son's bedside, her eyes hollow and fixed on the rise and fall of his chest, terrified that each shallow breath might be his last. The doctors had stabilized Noah's heart, but his body remained still, locked in a coma that seemed almost deliberate, as if he were hovering between two worlds, unwilling to choose. Every few hours, machines beeped softly, reminders that life still clung to him, fragile and uncertain. The words of the doctor echoed endlessly in their minds, only a miracle could bring him back. And miracles, in Genoa City, were rare. When the police released their preliminary report, Nick's world turned darker. The surveillance footage confirmed what he already feared: a masked man had entered the hospital in the dead of night, walked with chilling confidence through the restricted corridors, and vanished just before the security feed returned to normal. The poison had been identified as the same neurotoxin Matt once used during his days working in illegal biotech research. It was enough to brand him as the prime suspect, yet without a clear image of his face, the police hesitated. There was no evidence, no witness, no confession. Only the suffocating certainty that he was out there, breathing the same air, watching them suffer. Nick couldn't stand it. The rage building inside him felt volcanic. He stormed out of the hospital despite Sharon's desperate pleas, his voice breaking as he promised he would bring Matt in himself. Sharon, still trembling, knew it was pointless to stop him. She had seen that look before, the same one Victor wore whenever someone dared threaten his family. Nick's steps echoed through the empty parking lot, his mind consumed with vengeance. He called every contact he had, every investigator Victor ever hired, demanding they track down Matt's last known address. But by the time they arrived at his apartment, it was empty. Drawers were open, shelves stripped bare, clothes gone. The only thing left was a faint smell of burnt paper and a shattered phone on the floor, as if Matt had deliberately erased every trace of his existence. Sienna, meanwhile, sat alone in her apartment, her hands shaking as she clutched her phone. She had called Matt dozens of times, her messages turning from desperate to furious, but he never answered. She replayed their last conversation in her mind, the way his voice trembled when he warned her that Noah wouldn't be safe. At the time, she thought he meant emotional danger, not murder. Now, every syllable of that warning felt like an omen. Tears streamed down her face as guilt clawed at her chest. She should have told Sharon everything. She should have told Nick that Matt had been following them for weeks. But fear had silenced her, and now silence had taken Noah away. When Nick returned to the hospital hours later, his face was pale with defeat. Sharon looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "He's gone," Nick whispered. "Matt's gone." The words hung in the sterile air like poison. Sharon turned her gaze back to Noah, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Her voice trembled. "Then we wait," she said softly, almost to herself. "We wait for him to wake up. We wait for a miracle." Nick swallowed hard, his anger collapsing under the weight of helplessness. For the first time in years, he realized there was nothing he could fight, no enemy he could punch or outwit. His son's life was beyond his reach, suspended in the fragile hands of fate. The doctors spoke cautiously, explaining that Noah's vital signs were steady but his brain activity was unpredictable. "He's fighting," the lead physician said. "But the toxin caused severe neurological trauma. We can't predict if or when he'll regain consciousness. All we can do now is maintain his stability and hope." Hope, that word had become both a blessing and a curse. Sharon clung to it like a lifeline, whispering prayers over Noah's motionless form. Nick hated it because it demanded surrender, and surrender was something no Newman ever tolerated. Yet even Victor, when he visited briefly, could only place a heavy hand on his son's shoulder and murmur that sometimes strength meant waiting. Night fell again, heavy and suffocating. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and gray. Sharon dozed in the chair beside Noah's bed, her fingers still entwined with his. Nick stood by the window, staring at his reflection, haunted by memories. He saw flashes of Noah as a child, his first steps, his laughter, the proud look on Sharon's face the day they brought him home from school. Those moments now felt like distant echoes from another lifetime. He turned toward the bed, his throat tightening. He wanted to tell his son how sorry he was, for every argument, every failed promise, every time he hadn't been there. But the words wouldn't come. The silence between them had become its own language, one of grief and guilt and unspoken love. Sienna arrived quietly around midnight, her face pale under the fluorescent light. Sharon's eyes opened immediately, and for a moment, the two women simply looked at each other, one grieving, the other drowning in guilt. "I didn't know," Sienna whispered. "I swear I didn't know he would come here." Sharon said nothing, only turned back to Noah. The unspoken accusation lingered between them. Sienna approached the bed, tears spilling down her cheeks. She brushed her fingers against Noah's hand and flinched at how cold it felt. "Please wake up," she whispered. "You can't leave me like this." When Nick saw her, his expression hardened. He blamed her as much as he blamed Matt. She had been part of Noah's world, part of the secret that had brought this nightmare upon them. But he couldn't bring himself to yell. The fury had burned out, leaving only exhaustion. He told her to go home, but she refused. She stayed, curled in a corner of the room, crying silently until dawn. The next morning, detectives returned with grim updates. Matt had abandoned his car near the outskirts of Genoa City. Inside, they found traces of the same neurotoxin used on Noah, along with a disposable mask and empty vials. But fingerprints were wiped clean, and no camera caught his escape. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. One officer suggested that Matt might have fled the country, using one of his old biotech contacts to disappear under a new identity. Another theorized that someone else could be pulling the strings, that Matt was merely a pawn in a much larger game. But for Nick and Sharon, none of it mattered. The only truth they cared about was lying unconscious in that hospital bed. Days turned into weeks. Noah's condition remained unchanged. Each morning brought the same sterile routine, doctors checking vitals, nurses adjusting 4 lines, Sharon whispering words of love that went unanswered. Nick had stopped going home altogether, sleeping in short, restless bursts on the couch outside the room. He refused to believe that his son's mind was gone. Somewhere deep inside, he could feel Noah's presence, a faint pulse, a fragile thread connecting them still. He told himself that his son could hear him, that his voice might be the anchor pulling Noah back from the edge. Sienna continued visiting in secret, often late at night when Sharon dozed off. She brought small things Noah loved, his sketchbook, an old photo of the two of them by the lake, the guitar pick he always carried in his pocket. She would sit quietly and tell him stories, hoping her voice might reach him in the silence. But every visit ended the same way, with tears, regret, and the sound of machines humming softly in the background. Meanwhile, Nick's frustration deepened. The police had stopped giving updates. The media had moved on. Genoa City buzzed with news scandals, but for the Newmans, time had frozen on that night of horror. Victor urged Nick to focus on the company, but Nick refused. He had one goal left, to find Matt, alive or dead. He reached out to private operatives, hired investigators across state lines, even offered a reward for information. Still, nothing. It was as if Matt had evaporated, leaving behind only ghosts and questions. Then, one evening, something changed. Sharon was sitting by Noah's bedside when she felt the faintest movement beneath her hand, a twitch, a tremor so small she thought she imagined it. Her heart leapt, and she called the doctor immediately. They ran tests, checked the monitors, and for the first time in weeks, there was measurable improvement. Brain activity had increased. The doctor smiled faintly but cautioned them not to get their hopes too high. "It could be reflex," he said gently. "Or it could mean he's trying to come back." Those words reignited a flicker of faith inside Sharon. She refused to leave Noah's side after that, talking to him constantly, recounting memories, singing softly, anything that might draw him back to consciousness. Nick, though skeptical, found himself daring to believe again. The miracle the doctor had spoken of might not be impossible after all. But miracles often come with a price. As night fell, a nurse entered the room to check Noah's for. Sharon noticed the woman's nervous glance and the slight tremor in her hands. Something about her felt off, her uniform too new, her badge slightly misaligned.